We've become largely immune to most of the craziness that rock stars get up to. Arrested for drugs? Yawn. Got into a bar fight? So what else is new? A DUI? What, another one? There is a red line. Anything to do with any kind of sexual assault is still properly greeted with revulsion. Murder, still considered a bad thing. And if pedophilia is involved, well, there's no coming back from that. But once upon a time, when all rock and roll was considered dangerous, any kind of bad behavior made the news and resulted in widespread condemnation in the media, from church pulpits, from teachers, and from parents. The Rolling Stones built their early career on bad behavior. Although they were good friends with the squeaky-clean Beatles, they were artfully positioned to be the anti-Beatles, the bad boys of rock and roll. It was all very clever and very effective. I talked to Bob Geldof about those early days of the Rolling Stones.
Then you get the Rolling Stones. There's no way that they would have broken through with that racket. Pure punk, But suddenly you see these five people, utter contemptuous insolence, just staring out at you from the screen, looking weird, But you got it. All of us got it simultaneously.
As mild as some of the Stones' offenses seem today, back then they were considered outrageous and dangerous. The authorities, police, judges, politicians, church people were really out to get them, and that is not an exaggeration. And in the process, the Rolling Stones amassed a very long rap sheet. There were no fewer than 13 instances where the Stones were in big trouble with the law. This is episode 31 of Uncharted: Crime and Mayhem in the Music Industry. Let's examine the impressive and decades-long arrest record of the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones, from the summer of 1968, back when the establishment considered them to be the most dangerous, most subversive, and most immoral rock band of all time. They were an offense to society. They were an offense to good manners and good taste and God and all that was British. And later, all that was American and Canadian. And the powers that be were out to get them. And like I said earlier, that is not an exaggeration. Hello again, I'm Alan Cross, and on this episode of Uncharted, we're going to recount the mayhem caused by the Rolling Stones and their many encounters with the law. Again, these offenses are tame by modern standards, but there were several times when their brushes with the law threatened to break up the band forever. But now, Mick Jagger is a knight, so go figure. Context is everything to these stories. Like Bob Geldof said, the Rolling Stones landed in staid, mid-60s Britain with the subtlety of an extinction-level asteroid event. The British establishment viewed all rock and roll with suspicion and disdain. Even the Beatles, with their long hair, smart alecky banter, and whatever caused young people, and especially young women, to lose their minds screaming, was not looked upon kindly. Yet the Beatles were the good guys. For all their hysteria-causing faults, they did seem like lads you might want to have over for tea. The Rolling Stones, on the other hand, were positioned as the end of civilization. Their manager, Andrew Loog Oldham, was a big part of this. He knew that if he could make the Rolling Stones into the yang of the Beatles' yin, it would be a publicity windfall. By promoting the Stones as the bad boys of rock, there was money to be made. When the Stones arrived in America for their first tour in June 1964, 4 months after the Beatles broke all TV records with their appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show, Loog Oldham made sure that the press was in a lather. Many newspaper headlines were some version of this: "Would you let your daughter marry a Rolling Stone?" The bands completely went along with this. Check out this CBC interview for the news program This Hour Has 7 Days. This was broadcast on November 14th, 1965.
What do you think of the screamies that bother you every time you get in there? I mean, what truthfully you think?
The what?
They
don't bother us any time. The scream.
The screamies. The young ladies who...
The screamies are those who scream.
Yes.
They don't right. Well, they're part and parcel of our daily life.
What about the standard charge that no one will let their daughter marry a Rolling Stone? And what they wouldn't mind if the daughter married a Beatle?
Proof. Two of them already did. I married one.
You married a Rolling Stone? What do you think of adults and everybody else who blame you for all the problems teenagers are undergoing right now?
Well, I blame them for sort of, they're the parents. They're initially responsible for everything.
My parents were responsible for me.
What's this bit about you walking around in bathing suits and being old as girls in Texas?
It was in Florida. No, it was in Georgia. And what can you expect from Georgia?
No, we were in the swimming pool of a motel which happened to be by the roadside, and some cops came up and apparently some typical Georgia idiot. And Georgia is full of idiots. And sort of said that there were a lot of girls prancing around. Don't give it,
All right, now you earlier your manager told me to ask you a serious question.
Yeah.
All right, here you are, a leading exponent of British culture for whatever it is. What do you think of the revulsion situation?
Yeah.
Well, what do you give credit for your success now? What is it?
Music.
Our records are sold, and we've
good records and good promotion, I suppose. I mean, what else do I mean? Good records.
Well, Pavlov, you're always being accused of being vulgar, obstinate, and hostile, are you?
That's right, yes.
Well, I don't judge
We're uncouth and obstinate when
maybe, but I don't think vulgar and hostile.
We're only hostile when we're
People don't like the truth, man.
No, I want to hear what you have to say.
We're only hostile when people are hostile to us. We're not hostile to people as a matter of course.
By the time that interview aired, the Stones had already been in trouble with the police. Their first run-in with the law happened on March 18, 1965. The band was on their way home to London from a gig at the ABC Cinema in Romford, England, where they performed with the Hollies and several other bands, including one called the Conrads that featured some young guy named David Jones, who would later be David Bowie, of course. It's about a 1-hour drive back to London, but bass player Bill Wyman had plenty of beer that night and needed a bathroom. Besides, there was no time to visit the loo because the Stones wanted to escape a crowd of screaming girls, so they just roared away at about 11:10 p.m. So Bill had to go to the bathroom. No problem. So keyboardist Ian Stewart, who was driving Mick's brand new black Daimler, pulled into a Francis service station on Romford Road east of London about 20 minutes later. Wyman went to the attendant and said, "Where can we have a leak here?" The person manning the pumps, a 41-year-old man named Charles Keatley, was not a fan. He described Wyman as a shaggy-haired monster wearing dark glasses. "There's no toilet here, mate," he said. "You best be on your way." But that's probably not how the conversation actually went. Mick joined Bill and gave the guy some lip. So did Brian Jones, somehow referring to his foreskin in the process. Wyman wrote this in his memoir. "Absolutely bursting to go, I returned to the car, where I explained what happened. Mick Jagger took my hand and said, 'Come on, Bill, we'll find you a toilet.' And then Mick, myself, Joey Page, and Brian Jones returned to the attendant and asked him once more if we could use the toilet. He started screaming at us. Jagger had a response, 'We'll piss anywhere, man.' And at this point, 3 of the Stones, Bill, Mick, and Keith, started chanting, 'We'll piss anywhere, man.' And they lined up along the gas station wall and did just that. Meanwhile, Charlie Watts was reading a newspaper in the car, and Brian Jones was said to be asleep in the back of that car. A small crowd gathered, some of whom yelled encouragement and caused something of a disturbance. The Stones reveled in the attention, making some rude gestures, you can probably imagine what, and some obscene remarks. Somehow, the police showed up almost immediately, even before anyone literally had a chance to zip up. And they were all arrested. That's one story. Another is that they finished their business and drove off, but not before someone had noted their license plate, a witness named Mr. Eric Lavender. He was annoyed by these boorish antics and may have been the person who called the cops, saying that he'd press for private prosecution for this disgusting behavior. Stone's car was pulled over and they were arrested. Whatever the truth, the story was in all the papers 2 days later, starting with the Daily Express. Well, cue the outrage. On July 22, 1965, Jagger, Brian Jones, and Bill Wyman were summoned to West Ham London Magistrates Court to face charges. The gallery was filled with Stones fans. Keith, who was a whizzing participant, was not charged. He was called as a witness, and his testimony was, nothing happened. Brian Jones's testimony included this statement: "We drank only Coca-Cola and tea. We were very happy because we had had a great night. I was not aggressive. We were laughing a lot because Mr. Keeley's behavior was comical. We are rather more mature than that." In the end, they were fined £5 each. They were found guilty of using insulting behavior whereby a breach of the peace may have occurred. Meanwhile, Wyman was found not guilty of using insulting language to the annoyance of the public. I quote Judge A.C. Morley, "Just because you have reached the exalted heights of your profession, this does not mean you have the right to act like this." Bad press was good press, and the story only helped the Rolling Stones' ascent into stardom. By the way, that Francis service station is no longer there. There's now a personal care home for the elderly on that site. The next run-in with the law was substantially more dangerous and threatening. It was February 12, 1967, and has gone down in history as one of the most notorious police actions against any rock group ever. This is the Redlands drug bust. Again, we have to put everything into context. It's early 67, and the counterculture is everywhere, frightening the older generation and the establishment. The Rolling Stones were practically declared enemies of the state, enemies of the people, and the British newspapers were leading the charge in the name of common decency. Moody Blues, The Who, and Cream were initial targets. One of the papers, the News of the World, was really going after rock stars over drug use, ginning things up with a 3-part expose entitled "Pop Stars and Hard Drugs, Facts That Will Shock You." Part 1, published on January 29, 1967, outed Donovan, leading to a raid on his house resulting in drug charges. Part 2 went after the Stones. The story, published on February 5, 1967, carried an eyewitness account of a member of the band taking Benzedrine, a form of speed, at a club. That same person allegedly showed off a bit of hash and invited friends back to his house for a smoke. Which Stone? Well, the paper said it was Mick, but in fact, it was Brian Jones. Jagger was furious at the misidentification and 2 days later filed a lawsuit against the News of the World. He needed to clear his name immediately because any drug charges could completely derail the process of getting visas for an upcoming American tour. Jagger also had an airtight alibi. He was not at the club the night in question. This created a problem for the paper. They had to prove that Jagger was in fact a drug user. 2 very aggressive reporters began staking out Jagger, even to the point of tapping phone lines. And then on Saturday, February 11th, there was a tip from an informant, allegedly. Keith Richards was hosting a weekend for some of his friends at his Redlands estate in West Wittering, Sussex. He'd purchased the spread the previous year and was living in a large thatched cottage that dated back to the 13th century. It was Keith, his dog Ratbag, and Mick. Mick's then-girlfriend Marianne Faithfull was also there. So were half a dozen others. There was a guy named David Schneiderman who had the nickname Acid King. He never went anywhere without his briefcase full of drugs. Groovy Bob was there too. He was an art dealer that often organized parties attended by the Stones, the Beatles, and other celebrities. George Harrison and his wife Patty Boyd dropped into Redlands for a bit but didn't stay long. They'd hoped to see Mick drop acid for the first time, but Mick was sick, so they thought they'd just leave him alone. Meanwhile, Scotland Yard got a tip from the News of the World. Detective Sergeant Norman Pilcher and a team of 18 officers stormed the house. Now, Norman Pilcher would later show up in the Beatles story. He's referred to in the song I Am the Walrus. But that's another tale. The police contingent also included 2 female officers, prepared to do body cavity searches on any women at the party. The house was thoroughly searched during the raid, which made Keith nervous. If they found anything, it would all be pinned on him as the owner of the premises. But for all the noise, very little was uncovered. A couple of amphetamine pills, the remains of a few joints, and a quantity of heroin on Groovy Bob. So, no charges were filed that night. But there were stories. The most salacious was that the cops had interrupted an orgy. You may have heard the infamous tale of a naked Marianne Faithfull wrapped up in a fur rug with a Mars bar. And if you really must know where the Mars bar comes in, feel free to Google that. Pure fiction, but we are talking about the British tabloids. One headline read, "Naked Girl at Stone's Party." Who was the informant? Suspicion fell on Patrick, Mick and Keith's chauffeur. It could have been David Schneiderman. It could have been Tom Keylock, a partygoer who had a cop for a brother. Regardless of whoever tipped off the police, the raid ratcheted up the paranoia, not just around the Stones, but for every other musician who liked the occasional bit of recreational drugs. Things were weird in the days that followed. Andrew Loog Oldham, the Stones' manager, was so freaked out that he fled to America instead of staying behind to help sort things out, which would eventually lead to his sacking as the Stones' manager. Mick and Keith needed an escape, so they went to Paris, then Spain, and then Morocco. There were 2 close calls with local authorities over hotel bills and a restaurant that wouldn't accept a credit card, but they were generally okay. Back in Britain, though, authorities were very serious about sending a message to the youth of the nation that such behavior was not to be tolerated in Her Majesty's kingdom. And on May 10th, 1967, both Jagger and Richards were in court to plead not guilty. On June 29th, Mick was fined £200 and sentenced to 3 months in jail for possession of 4 amphetamine tablets. Keith was found guilty of allowing cannabis products to be consumed on his property, and his sentence was 1 year in prison and a fine of £500. Jagger was sent to Brixton Prison. Richards was sent to Wormwood Scrubs Prison. They spent the night there, but were released in the morning on bail pending trial. The first trial, the one based on the Redlands raid, was a media circus. And going into court, it looked like the Rolling Stones were in real trouble. A lengthy jail sentence for Mick and Keith was definitely possible. But on July 1st, 1967, an editorial appeared in the Times of London. Now, this is a very conservative newspaper. The editor, Williams Reed Mogg, wrote a scathing piece highly critical of the justice system and the police. I quote, "Mr. Jagger received a more severe sentence than would have been thought proper for any purely anonymous young man. He also asked the famous question, who breaks a butterfly on a wheel?" A month later, the Times carried a full-page ad that read, "The law against marijuana is immoral in principle and unworkable in practice." Again, this is 1967. This led to the whole Rolling Stones case being discussed in Parliament. In the end, Keith's sentence was overturned on appeal. He went free. Jagger got a conditional discharge, and he was free to go too. Furthermore, the public was completely on the side of the Rolling Stones in this matter. The whole case was a defining moment in the war between rock and the establishment in the UK. And while the ordeal took its toll on the Stones, they emerged from the controversy more popular than ever. 6 months after the arrest, the Stones released this song called "I Love You" to show their appreciation for the support they got from fans. There was one more notable run-in with the police in the 1960s. It came in 1968 when Mick was caught with a tiny bit of weed on his person. He was arrested, but he was let off with a fine, so no big deal. However, there was more to come. The 70s were filled with Stones drug busts, and the one that happened in Toronto was the biggest threat to the Stones of them all. This is a look at the lengthy rap sheet of the Rolling Stones, a summary of all the times the band almost came to an end because authorities seemed determined to squash them once and for all. After the Redlands bust and Mick's minor weed possession charge, the group, now bigger than ever and therefore a bigger threat to the establishment than ever, got rocked when Keith was arrested for cocaine possession in France. The Stones were in France because in 1971 they moved there as tax exiles. They were making so much money that had they stayed in Britain, 93% of their earnings would have been payable in tax. That's when their trusted financial advisor, Prince Rupert Lowenstein, suggested that they move to France for a while. Mick and his girlfriend Bianca found a place in Biot, a town near Nice. Bill Wyman moved to a town called Grasse, and Charlie Watts insisted on staying at a farm 6 hours away. Keith found a nearby villa called Nelcote on the Côte d'Azur that dated back to the 1890s, and it once also served as a Gestapo headquarters during World War II. The Rolling Stones' mobile recording truck was set up outside, and over the next few months, down in the sweltering hot basement, the band recorded one of their best albums, Exile on Main Street. And now you know where the title came from. At this point, though, Keith was deep into drugs, beyond just pot and pills. He was using heroin daily, and it was rumored that thousands of dollars worth of smack flowed through that villa on a weekly basis. Naturally, French police were curious about what these awful British musicians were doing, and in November 1971, 3 local men showed up in court to tell how they spent the summer selling all this heroin to Keith. Keith and his girlfriend, Anita Pallenberg, were tried in absentia and got suspended sentences. Things really could have ended up much worse. Heroin, cocaine charges. But there were more problems for Keith ahead. In 1973, he and saxophonist Bobby Keys were arrested at Keith's home in Chelsea over an unlicensed shotgun. There was a fine and a reprimand, but nothing more, other than Keith gaining a reputation as someone who was always in trouble with the law. Later that year, Keith and Anita were back in France, where they were arrested again, this time for possession of heroin and other drug-related offenses. No prison time, but by now immigration officials were onto them. Getting a visa to tour some countries was now very difficult. On July 18, 1972, Mick and Keith were in Warwick, Long Island, when a journalist tried to take their picture. They did not take kindly to that, and they assaulted the photographer. They were arrested, fined, and released. But the publicity was huge, especially because the band was supposed to play a show in Boston that night. This is when the mayor of Boston stepped in, ordering a siren-blaring police escort up Interstate 95 into the mayor's personal custody. It wasn't that Mayor Kevin White was a fan. His problem was that 15,000 people were jammed into Boston Garden. Logan Airport was fogged in, and if the Stones did not show, he was worried that there would be a riot. Well, they made the gig, albeit 3 hours late, starting things at 1 a.m. And who introduced them from the stage that night? Mayor White. "The Stones have been busted," he said, "but I sprung them." On July 5, 1975, while the Stones were on a 28-city tour of the U.S., Keith and new guitarist Ronnie Wood were driving from Memphis to the next gig in Dallas. Their route took them through a town called Fordyce in Arkansas. They had a bright yellow rented 1975 Chevy Impala. It was a long drive, so they stopped for lunch at the Fordyce restaurant. Keith had a T-bone and Ronnie loved the fried chicken. Both signed some autographs, and then they left. But then, shortly afterwards, this would be around 3 in the afternoon with Richards at the wheel of the Chevy, they were pulled over for alleged reckless driving. The 2 cops, a couple of good old Southern boys facing a couple of long-haired foreigners, smelled weed in the car. Everything was impounded. Now, no pot was found, but a search warrant yielded less than 2 grams of coke in a briefcase that belonged to Fred Sessler, who was a passenger in the car. Keith was totally straight, but he was carrying one of his beloved giant hunting knives, and this was determined to be an illegal weapon. Everyone was arrested. But with the help of the British Embassy, everyone was released by midnight, paying a traffic ticket worth $162.50. They ditched the Impala and flew to Dallas out of a nearby airport. It took until November 2006 for Keith to be pardoned by Arkansas, thanks to Governor Mick Huckabee. So everything is just fine, right? Well, no. The biggest bust since Redlands and the most dangerous happened. It is legendary. The Stones had been booked at the El Macombo, a famous rock and roll dive bar on Spadina Avenue in Toronto. Capacity, 300. It was supposed to be a secret gig in front of contest winners. The Stones were billed as the Cockroaches. Instead, it was a very poorly kept secret. And infamously, Margaret Trudeau, wife of the Prime Minister, showed up to party with the band, arriving at the front door in a limo with Mick. A live album was recorded on the nights of March 4th and 5th, 1977. The band arrived about a week earlier and settled into the Harbor Castle Hilton down by Lake Ontario. Trouble began even before they entered the country when Anita Pallenberg was arrested at the airport after a spoon with traces of heroin was found in her luggage. They also found 10 grams of hash. On February 27th, acting on a tip that there were more drugs to be found, cops raided Keith and Anita's hotel room. The search warrant had her name on it, and they found 22 grams of heroin, which was a lot. Meanwhile, Maggie Trudeau, who also had a room at the hotel, how convenient, was seen investigating the commotion while wearing her bathrobe. Both Keith and Anita appeared in court, but because it was Anita's name on the search warrant, Keith was released on just $1,000 bail. I quote Keith, who had to be slapped awake by an officer. "You can't arrest someone if they're sleeping." Keith had apparently been awake for 5 days on a bender. "It took them about 2 hours to drag me out. Pow, pow. I woke up with, rosy cheeks. Oh, he's awake. You are under arrest." "Oh, great." I looked at the old lady and said, "I'll see you in about 7 years, babe." Keith, of course, had no intention of selling those 22 grams of smack. He was a hardcore junkie, and this was for his own personal use. But if convicted, Keith faced up to 7 years in jail. This hung over the appearance at the Elmo Combo and the recording of that live album. On March 8th, Keith appeared in court again because police had done some analysis of the substances found in the hotel room, and not only were there 22 grams of heroin, but also 5 grams of cocaine. Keith was freed on $25,000 bail, with orders to return to stand trial, and with the understanding that he seek treatment for his addictions. Keith was allowed to keep his passport and was granted a medical visa by the U.S., and on April 1st, 1977, he flew to Philadelphia to a rehab facility before moving to the Stevens Psychiatric Center in New York. Keith's next trip to Toronto was in December 1977 for a preliminary hearing. He told the judge he wanted a trial by jury, which was granted, but a jury was never convened. It took until October 23rd and 24th, 1978 for the trial to begin, but by the time it did, Keith had undergone his transformation. He was so frightened by the prospect of doing hard time in a Canadian penitentiary that he got clean. When his lawyers presented his case in front of Judge Lloyd Grayburn, they explained that this had been a wake-up call, and the client was now sober and was never ever a dealer. Testimony came from Saturday Night Live producer Lorne Michaels, and Keith quietly dropped into the courthouse via a back entrance and dropped his request for a jury trial. The judge agreed with Keith's lawyers, and the next day, wearing a 3-piece suit and tie, and despite prosecutor Paul Kennedy asking for 6 to 12 months of jail time, Keith was charged with simple possession. Keith had not brought the drugs into Canada, but had purchased them locally, so any smuggling charges were now moot. But Keith was not off the hook. And for this part of the story, we need to go back a bit. A woman who was blind was determined to go to bat for Keith. Despite her blindness, she had hitchhiked to numerous Rolling Stones shows. She actually went to the judge's house and told him that Keith did not deserve to go to jail and that the Stones, and specifically Keith, meant the world to her. And this plea actually worked. I quote, "No incarceration or fine would be appropriate because of Mr. Richards' continuing treatment for drug addiction and his long-term benefit to the community." As part of his sentence, he received 1 year's probation, plus he was ordered to perform 2 benefit concerts for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind within the next 6 months. Again, this is the result of the blind woman's visit. Everyone was relieved. Even Paul Kennedy, the prosecutor, was okay with this. He said, "If you get a member of the Rolling Stones off heroin, then you've done some good." On April 22nd, 1979, at the Oshawa Civic Center, Keith, the Stones, and Ronnie Wood's band, the New Barbarians, played 2 shows in front of 5,000 people each time. That was the last time the Stones played 2 concerts in one day. And what of Anita Pallenberg's drug bust? Remember that? She appeared in court, pleaded guilty, and was fined $400. Now, you would think that the heroin bust in Toronto would have straightened everything out between the Rolling Stones and law enforcement. Well, no. There were still more problems to come. So far, we've documented 10 instances where the Rolling Stones had serious run-ins with the law, and we're still not done. In the summer of 1980, it was Bill Wyman's turn to get busted. The Quiet Stone and his girlfriend Astrid were arrested for drug possession in France. There was a fine, but no jail time. Once again, though, the Stones were in the news for being these crazy, drugged-out rock stars. Things were quiet for a few years, but then Mick was pulled over in New York for a very minor infraction. He was driving but didn't have a driver's license. Not a big deal, really, and he was let off with a fine. And for a long, long time, a decade in fact, the Stones had no run-ins with the police at all. In 1994, Keith got pulled over for reckless driving in Virginia. Nothing but a small fine. And again, it stayed quiet for a while. But then came the palm tree incident in Fiji. One morning in May 2006, the world awoke to the news that Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones had climbed a palm tree and had fallen out of it. It wasn't a big tree, maybe 7 feet, but he hit the ground hard. Someone called him for lunch as he tried to get down, and he fell. He landed feet first, but the jolt threw his head back against the trunk of the tree very hard. It hurt, but he shook it off. At worst, it was nothing more than a mild concussion and a bump on the head. A couple of days later, though, Keith was out for a sail and took another jolt when the boat hit a big wave. That's when the headaches started. They were so bad that he was taken to the hospital, where an MRI revealed that he had a brain bleed, an acute cerebral hematoma. He was in serious danger. A call was made to Dr. Andrew Law, who was 1,700 miles away in New Zealand, and, as it turns out, a major fan of the Rolling Stones. Keith was flown to Auckland and admitted to hospital to see if the blood clot would dissolve on its own. It did not. Within a week, it was obvious Keith was in big trouble. The headaches were worse. He was very weak, and he started slurring his words. The clot was a big one, almost 2 centimeters. The artery connected to it kept bleeding, so Dr. Law had to go into Keith's skull to repair the damage. He did, and he saved Keith's life. Okay, so where did the cops come in? Well, Keith was arrested in New Zealand on cannabis possession before he had a chance to rejoin the band on their world tour. He was detained briefly, but then was allowed to go on his way. So, there are 13 main Rolling Stone run-ins with the law. But that's still not all of them. Both Keith and Mick have had minor issues with cannabis possession that amounted to nothing that aren't on our list. But, and again, this is really important, the Stones cemented their reputation as the bad boys of rock and roll without suffering any serious legal consequences. Is this because they are famous? Absolutely. But let's not forget that they had some excellent legal representation that managed to stem all the damage. Today, Mick Jagger is a knight. Keith Richards remains an icon. Ronnie Woods is a respected painter and artist. Bill Wyman quit the band in the early 80s and is enjoying a quiet retirement. Charlie Watts, also very quiet. He stayed out of any kind of trouble until he died on August 24th, 2021. Then there's the matter of Brian Jones. Although he was kicked out of the band in 1969, he died under mysterious circumstances in his swimming pool. And if you want that story, check out episode 19 of this podcast. If you have any questions or comments about anything you hear on the podcast, shoot me an email, alan@alancross.ca. We can meet up on all the social media sites along with my website, which is a journalofmusicalthings.com. It's updated with music news and recommendations every day. And there's the free daily newsletter that you should get. Oh, and please check out my other podcast, The Ongoing History of New Music, which deals with rock music at large. And there are hundreds and hundreds of episodes that you can enjoy for free. See you next time for more stories of crime and mayhem in the music industry. Episodes arrive every 2 weeks. Technical productions by Rob Johnston. I'm Alan Cross.